The morning was clear over Denver International Airport when Continental Flight 1713 prepared for departure. It was September 14th, 2003, and the Boeing 757 sat waiting on the tarmac, its white fuselage glinting under the early autumn sun. On board were 115 passengers and a crew of 6, all headed for Boston on what should have been a routine 4-hour flight across the heartland and into New England. The crew had gone through the usual checks, the passengers were settled in their seats, and the engines rumbled to life as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. There was nothing in the weather reports to suggest trouble, and the last messages from the flight deck were routine, calm, and unremarkable. Captain Michael Rhodes, a veteran pilot with over 20,000 flight hours, sat in the left seat, running through the pre-flight checklist with his co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Carlisle. Both were experienced aviators who had flown this route dozens of times, and the morning's procedures unfolded with the comfortable rhythm of long practice. Behind them in the cabin, 4 flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and securing overhead compartments while greeting passengers with practiced smiles. The lead attendant, Susan Martinez, had been with the airline for 15 years and knew the 757's layout as well as her own home. Everything about the morning felt familiar, predictable, and safe. The passenger manifest told the story of an ordinary cross-country flight. Business travellers in suits occupied most of the forward cabin, laptops already open on tray tables despite the departure announcement. A family of 4 sat together in row 12, the children clutching stuffed animals and colouring books for the journey ahead. An elderly couple held hands near the rear of the aircraft, heading to visit grandchildren they had not seen in months. College students with backpacks dozed in middle seats, already exhausted from early connections. Among them were engineers, teachers, salespeople, and retirees, a cross-section of American life, bound together only by their shared destination and the randomness of ticket purchases made weeks or days before. The weather conditions were nearly perfect, with clear skies stretching from the Rockies to the Atlantic, scattered clouds at high altitude, and winds that would push the flight along its route with gentle assistance. The temperature sat at a comfortable 68 degrees, and visibility extended for miles in every direction. Air traffic controllers in the tower had tracked the aircraft's preparation without concern, noting its position among the morning's departures with the casual efficiency of professionals managing a busy airport. The 757 joined the queue of aircraft waiting for takeoff clearance, its engines idling smoothly as Captain Rhodes received final routing instructions and confirmed the flight plan one last time. Once cleared for departure, the aircraft rolled forward onto the active runway, its landing gear wheels tracking the centerline with precision as Rhodes advanced the throttles and the twin engines spun up to full power. The familiar acceleration pressed passengers back into their seats as the aircraft gathered speed, the white line of the runway blurring beneath the nose, while the Rocky Mountains rose in the distance behind them. At precisely the calculated speed, Rhodes eased back on the yoke, and the 757 lifted smoothly into the air, climbing steadily as the landing gear retracted with a solid thunk felt throughout the cabin. Flight attendants remained seated during the initial ascent, and passengers watched through windows as Denver fell away beneath them, the city's grid pattern shrinking into toy-like miniature, while the aircraft banked gently to the northeast. The first radio transmission after departure was textbook standard. Rhodes confirmed the aircraft's altitude, heading, and climb rate with air traffic control, his voice carrying none of the tension that would later be analysed and reanalyzed by investigators searching for any hint of awareness. The controllers acknowledged and cleared the flight to continue its climb to 35,000 feet, the cruising altitude that would carry them efficiently across the plains, states, and into New England. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into the flight's rhythm as the seatbelt sign chimed off, and flight attendants rose to begin their service, wheeling carts from the galley while the aircraft levelled into its cruise phase. For those first minutes, Flight 1713 was indistinguishable from thousands of other commercial flights crossing American skies that morning. The aircraft performed flawlessly, its systems monitoring themselves and reporting normal status to the flight deck displays. The passengers occupied themselves with books, magazines, music and conversation, their thoughts already drifting toward what waited for them in Boston rather than dwelling on the mechanics of flight. The crew moved through their routines with the confidence born of repetition, unaware that they were living through the last normal moments any of them would experience. The sun climbed higher as the aircraft flew eastward, and somewhere far below, the landscape scrolled past in its familiar patterns of fields and towns, rivers and roads, all of it ordinary, all of it unremarkable, all of it about to be rendered meaningless by what was coming. At 35,000 feet, the aircraft levelled into its cruise phase, the engines settling into their steady drone as flight attendants prepared the beverage service. The seatbelt sign had chimed off minutes earlier, and passengers stretched in their seats or stood to retrieve items from overhead bins. Susan Martinez moved down the aisle with a practiced smile, taking drink orders and dispensing napkins while the aircraft hummed along its programmed route. Behind her, another attendant rolled a cart from the galley, the familiar rhythm of service beginning as it had on countless flights before. In the cockpit, Captain Rhodes adjusted the autopilot settings and leaned back slightly, the tension of takeoff and climb giving way to the more relaxed phase of high-altitude cruise. The last routine radio check came at 8:43 in the morning, Mountain Time. Rhodes confirmed the aircraft's position with Denver Center, his voice clear and unhurried as he acknowledged a minor course adjustment that would take them slightly north of their planned track to avoid some high-altitude turbulence forming over Kansas. The controller responded with standard acknowledgement, and the brief exchange ended, as it should have, with no indication that anything was amiss. Flight 1713 appeared on radar screens as a solid return, tracking northeast at 530 knots, exactly where it should be and exactly when it should be there. In the cabin, passengers had settled into the flight's comfortable monotony. Some read paperbacks or magazines, others worked on laptops despite the absence of Wi-Fi, and a few had already dozed off with pillows wedged against windows. The family in row 12 played a quiet card game, the mother keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing nearby travellers. The elderly couple near the rear shared a crossword puzzle, their heads bent together over the newsprint as they debated a 7-letter word for an ancient city. Flight attendants moved through the aisles distributing drinks, their movements efficient and practiced, occasionally pausing to help a passenger reach an overhead item or answer a question about arrival time. 12 minutes after the last radio transmission, Denver Center attempted a routine position check. The controller's voice carried the casual tone of a question asked hundreds of times each shift, expecting the standard response that would confirm the flight's continued progress. The radio frequencies hummed with the usual traffic of commercial aviation. Other flights, checking in and out, as they crossed invisible boundaries in the sky, but from Flight 1713 there was no answer. The controller waited the appropriate interval and tried again, his tone still relaxed, assuming perhaps a moment of cockpit distraction or a stuck microphone switch. Again, silence answered where a voice should have been. By the third attempt, the controller's posture had shifted slightly, his attention focusing more intently on the radar return that continued to move smoothly across his screen. The aircraft's transponder was functioning perfectly, broadcasting altitude, speed and identification exactly as it should. Visually, on every instrument available to the controller, Flight 1713 appeared completely normal. It maintained its assigned altitude within 50 feet. Its speed varied by no more than 3 knots, and its heading tracked the programmed route with the precision only an autopilot could maintain. Yet the radio remained silent, the cockpit, crew offering no acknowledgement to repeated calls. Other aircraft in the vicinity were asked to attempt contact on the emergency frequency. Pilots in nearby airspace switched their radios and made the calls, their voices professional but carrying an undertone of concern that came from understanding what radio silence might mean. Some reported they could see the 757 in the distance, a white speck against blue sky, flying straight and level with no visible signs of distress. No smoke trailed from the engines, no pieces separated from the airframe, and the aircraft's flight characteristics appeared entirely normal to those who observed it from miles away. The plane simply would not answer. Controllers in Denver notified their counterparts in Kansas City, whose airspace the flight would soon enter. The shift supervisor was informed, and within minutes the situation had escalated through the standard protocols that govern such events. The airline's operations center received notification, and duty managers began pulling up the flight's details while simultaneously trying to reach the cockpit through the aircraft's satellite communication system. Those attempts, like the radio calls, went unanswered. The plane continued flying, its systems apparently functioning, while every attempt at communication disappeared into an inexplicable void. In the cabin, passengers noticed nothing wrong. The flight attendants continued their service, moving smoothly through practiced routines. The engines maintained their steady hum. The wings held their proper angle, and sunlight streamed through the windows in the familiar way of high-altitude flight. If anyone aboard sensed something amiss, they gave no sign that would later be visible in the fragmentary records that survived. The beverage service continued, snacks were distributed, and the ordinary business of a transcontinental flight unfolded in the cabin. While on the ground, controllers watched the aircraft's progress with growing alarm. The silence was not dramatic. There had been no final transmission filled with panic or confusion, no sudden break in communication that might suggest equipment failure or emergency. The radio had simply stopped carrying voices from Flight 1713, as if someone had turned off a switch and walked away. The aircraft flew on, perfect in every measurable way except for the absence of the one thing that connected it to the world below. When attempts to raise the flight crew extended past 30 minutes without response, air traffic control initiated emergency procedures, their voices carrying an urgency that spread through the control tower like a current. The shift supervisor stood behind the controller's station, watching the radar return that represented Flight 1713 continue its smooth progress across the screen, while every attempt to establish communication met with silence. Standard protocol required escalation, and within minutes, multiple agencies were being notified of an aircraft that appeared operational but had become completely unresponsive to all contact attempts. The Federal Aviation Administration's command center received notification first, their duty officers immediately pulling up the flight's data and confirming what Denver Center had reported. The aircraft's transponder showed normal altitude and speed, its path tracked precisely along the programmed route, yet it might as well have been a ghost for all the response it gave to radio calls. The airline's operations center was brought into the loop, and engineers began reviewing the 7557's maintenance history and system capabilities, searching for any technical explanation that might account for total communication failure while the aircraft continued to fly perfectly. Military radar installations were queried for their tracking data, and within the secure facilities of NORAD, operators confirmed what civilian controllers already knew. The aircraft appeared on their screens exactly where it should be, moving at commercial cruise speed with no deviation from its flight plan. No other aircraft operated near it. No unusual radar returns suggested external interference, and the flight's characteristics remained utterly normal in every measurable parameter. The mystery was not in what the screens showed, but in what the radios did not carry. The decision to scramble fighter aircraft came quickly, though not without debate among those coordinating the response. In the years since September 11th, protocols for unresponsive aircraft had been refined and rehearsed, though no one involved wanted to consider the implications that those protocols might ultimately require. Two F-16 fighters lifted from a base in Colorado, their pilots briefed on the situation and given instructions to intercept, observe, and attempt visual communication with the commercial aircraft. The fighters climbed rapidly through the thin air, their powerful engines driving them toward the altitude, where Flight 1713 continued its eastward journey. The intercept occurred over the Kansas plains, where the vast flatness below offered no distractions from the scene that unfolded at 35,000 feet. The lead fighter pilot approached from behind and below, pulling alongside the 757's left side at a distance of roughly 200 feet. Through his canopy, he could see the commercial aircraft in clear detail, its white fuselage unmarked by any visible damage, its engines producing the steady exhaust trails of normal operation. The wings held their proper angle, the control surfaces showed no unusual deflection, and nothing about the aircraft's appearance suggested mechanical distress. It looked, the pilot would later report, exactly like any other commercial flight he had ever seen. The fighter moved closer, positioning itself where the cockpit crew could not fail to see the military aircraft if they looked out their windows. The pilot rocked his wings in the internationally recognized signal for the other aircraft to follow, a gesture meant to communicate even if radios had failed. He held position for several minutes, his eyes scanning the cockpit windows for any sign of acknowledgement or response. Through the tinted glass he could make out shapes that he assumed were the pilots in their seats, but no movement suggested they had seen him or understood his signal. The commercial aircraft maintained its heading without the slightest deviation, as if flying itself with mechanical indifference to the armed fighter hanging off its wing. The second F-16 moved to the other side of the 757, attempting the same visual signals while its pilot tried different radio frequencies, hoping perhaps that some obscure channel might break through whatever barrier had isolated the commercial aircraft. Emergency frequencies, guard frequencies, and even commercial aviation frequencies carried the fighter pilot's calls, each one requesting that Flight 1713 acknowledge and provide some indication of its status. The radio waves carried the messages perfectly, but no answer came back. The commercial aircraft flew on, its autopilot maintaining the programmed path with an indifference that seemed almost deliberate in its completeness. Through binoculars and the advanced optics of the fighter aircraft's targeting systems, the pilots examined every visible portion of the 757. They looked for smoke, for structural damage, for any physical anomaly that might explain the communication failure. The cabin windows appeared normal, showing the typical darkened interior of a pressurized aircraft at altitude. No faces pressed against the glass, no hands waved for attention, and no emergency signals flashed from the aircraft's exterior lights. Everything about the plane suggested normal flight operations, yet the complete absence of response to visual signals added another layer to the growing impossibility of the situation. Ground controllers coordinated with the fighter pilots. Boston's Logan International Airport was notified of the situation, and emergency response teams began positioning themselves for whatever might unfold when the aircraft reached its destination. The decision was made to shadow Flight 1713 for the remainder of its journey, the fighters maintaining close formation, while the commercial aircraft continued its automated flight path toward New England. Every agency involved hoped for some break in the silence, some indication that would transform the mystery into a problem with a solution. But as the miles passed beneath them and the aircraft droned eastward, that hope began to feel increasingly distant. The landing gear descended at precisely the correct altitude, the aircraft's automated systems executing each phase of the approach with mechanical perfection, while fire trucks and ambulances tracked its path from the taxiway. Controllers at Logan International had cleared all other traffic from the runway and the surrounding airspace, giving Flight 1713 an empty corridor through which to complete its programmed descent. The fighter aircraft maintained their escort positions, their pilots watching as the commercial jet began its final approach with the same eerie precision that had characterized the entire flight. Every system aboard the 757 functioned exactly as designed, following the commands loaded into the flight management computer hours earlier in Denver, when human hands had programmed the route and living voices had confirmed the approach procedures. The aircraft crossed the outer marker at the prescribed altitude and speed, its autopilot making subtle adjustments to account for the light crosswind that blew across Boston Harbor. The nose pitched down slightly as the descent rate increased, and the wings rocked gently as the system compensated for wind shear in the lower altitudes. Through the cockpit windows, the fighter pilots could see no movement, no hands on the controls, no heads turning to check the approach path. The 757 flew itself with the smooth efficiency of a machine, untroubled by human uncertainty. Each adjustment calculated and executed without hesitation or second-guessing. Flaps extended in stages as the aircraft slowed, the complex mechanisms deploying from the wings with hydraulic precision. The spoilers rose slightly to dump lift, the landing gear locked into position with 3 distinct thumps that would have been felt throughout the cabin by anyone still capable of feeling, and the engines throttled back to idle thrust as the runway threshold approached. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway, their crews standing beside open doors, helmets on and equipment ready, though none of them knew what they were preparing for. Some watched through binoculars, others simply stared at the approaching aircraft, each person aware they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of commercial aviation. The main wheels touched down with barely a chirp, the landing so smooth that it would have earned compliments for the pilot under normal circumstances. The nose gear settled onto the concrete moments later, and the automatic systems deployed the thrust reversers, their distinctive roar echoing across the airport as the engines worked to slow the aircraft. The 757 tracked down the centerline with perfect precision, its electronic brain making constant micro-adjustments to keep the heavy aircraft exactly where it should be. Speed bled away in a controlled deceleration, the brakes applied with graduated pressure that no human hand was guiding, and within seconds the aircraft had slowed to taxi speed. The thrust reversers stowed themselves, the engines returned to forward idle, and the 757 began rolling toward the terminal area as if nothing were amiss. Air traffic controllers watched on their screens, fire chiefs coordinated their teams through radio headsets, and airline managers stood in the operations center, staring at monitors that showed a perfectly operational aircraft that had just completed a flawless automated landing. The fighter pilots peeled away, their mission complete now that the commercial jet was safely on the ground, though nothing about the situation felt safe or resolved. They climbed back toward altitude, leaving the 757 to taxi alone toward the spot where emergency crews waited. The aircraft followed its programmed taxi route with the same mechanical precision it had shown throughout the flight, turning at the correct intersections and maintaining appropriate speed along the taxiways. Controllers watched its progress, ready to issue instructions if it deviated from the expected path, but no deviation came. The plane rolled forward smoothly, its nose wheel steering functioning properly, its engines providing just enough thrust to overcome rolling resistance. At the designated holding point near Terminal C, the aircraft came to a complete stop, the brakes holding it motionless on the concrete, while the engines continued their steady idle. Then, following the final commands in its automated sequence, the engines wound down. The turbines spun slower and slower, their whine dropping in pitch until they fell silent, and the aircraft sat still and quiet on the taxiway. The only sounds came from the emergency vehicles approaching cautiously from multiple directions, their engines and warning systems creating a cacophony that contrasted sharply with the absolute silence emanating from the 757. Fire crews deployed around the aircraft in a practiced formation, their movements careful and deliberate, while paramedics stood ready with equipment for injuries they could only imagine. No one emerged from the aircraft, The cabin door remained closed, the emergency exit stayed sealed, and through the small windows, emergency personnel could see no movement inside. The aircraft sat exactly as any commercial jet would after completing its flight, engines off and systems powering down, but the absence of any human activity created a stillness that felt profoundly wrong. Crews waited for instructions, team leaders conferred through radio channels, and everyone present understood they were looking at something that should not exist, a modern airliner that had flown itself across the country and landed without pilot input, carrying passengers who had given no sign of their status throughout the entire ordeal. The decision to approach came from the incident commander, a fire chief with 30 years of experience who had never faced a scenario remotely similar to this one. A team of 4 moved forward with portable stairs, rolling the equipment toward the forward cabin door, while others stood ready with medical gear and firefighting equipment. The stairs locked into position against the fuselage, and a firefighter climbed toward the door, his movements watched by dozens of eyes and multiple cameras that had been positioned to document whatever unfolded. He reached the door and paused, his hand hovering over the emergency release handle, aware that opening this door would reveal something that would change aviation history forever. The moment stretched impossibly long, the entire airport seeming to hold its breath, and then the firefighter pulled the handle, the seal broke with a hiss and the door began to swing open. The first responder to enter the aircraft, Fire Captain David Chen, had prepared himself for many scenarios during his 22 years, with the Boston Fire Department, injured passengers, smoke damage, possibly a hijacking situation gone wrong. But what greeted him in the cabin defied every expectation his training and experience had built. The door swung open to reveal an interior that appeared completely normal at first glance, with overhead lights still illuminated, air conditioning system humming softly, and rows of seats stretching toward the rear of the aircraft in the familiar configuration of a commercial airliner. There was no smoke, no visible damage, no overturned luggage or signs of panic. The cabin looked exactly as it should after a routine cross-country flight, peaceful and orderly, except that no one was moving. Chen stepped inside, his boots landing softly on the carpeted aisle, and the absolute stillness struck him immediately. In a cabin that should have been filled with the sounds of passengers unbuckling seatbelts, reaching for overhead items, and preparing to deplane, there was only silence. He moved forward slowly, his eyes scanning the nearest rows, and saw a businessman in seat 3A with his laptop still open on the tray table. The screen dark but the computer's position, suggesting he had been working moments before. The man's head rested against the seat back, his expression utterly peaceful, as if he had simply dozed off during the flight. Chen reached out and touched the man's neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. The skin was still warm, the body's position natural and relaxed, but no heartbeat answered Chen's fingers. He moved to the next passenger, a woman in 3B with a magazine open in her lap, and found the same absence of life. Her reading glasses remained perched on her nose, her hand resting on the page as though she might turn it at any moment, but she would never turn another page. Chen's pulse quickened as the realization began to settle over him, and he called back to his team, his voice carrying a tension that made the other firefighters ascend the stairs more quickly than they had planned. More responders entered the cabin, and they spread through the aircraft with growing horror, checking passenger after passenger and finding each one dead. A family occupied row 12, the parents seated with their 2 children between them, and all 4 sat peacefully as if sleeping. The boy clutched a stuffed dinosaur, the girl had her head resting on her father's arm, and both parents showed expressions of calm repose. No tears marked their faces, no signs of fear or struggle disturbed their final positions, and the scene carried an unsettling quality of interrupted normalcy that made it somehow worse than any violence might have been. Throughout the cabin, the pattern repeated with horrifying consistency. Passengers sat in their assigned seats, some reclined and apparently dozing, others upright with books or devices in their hands, still others leaning against windows, with pillows tucked behind their heads. Beverage cups rested on tray tables, half empty and still cool to the touch. A crossword puzzle in row 27 showed careful pencil marks filling in answers, the work stopping mid-word as though the solver had simply paused to think. Personal electronics lay scattered on seats and laps, their screens dark but their positions suggesting recent use. Everything spoke of a flight in progress, of lives being lived at 35,000 feet. Yet every single person in every single seat was dead. The flight attendants were found at their stations, positioned exactly where they would have been during the flight. Susan Martinez sat in the forward jump seat, her expression serene, her uniform still crisp and professional. Another attendant was discovered in the galley area, standing upright but leaning slightly against the counter, as if death had found her in the middle of preparing the next round of service. A third sat in the rear cabin, her hand resting on an armrest, her posture suggesting she had been about to stand when whatever happened overtook her. None showed any indication of distress or awareness of their impending death. Chen made his way toward the cockpit, stepping carefully around emergency personnel, who were now moving through the cabin in a kind of shocked silence, each one confronting the impossible scene. The cockpit door stood open, and inside Captain Rhodes and First Officer Carlyle remained at their stations. Rhodes sat in the left seat, with his hands resting loosely on his lap, his body positioned as though he had simply leaned back to relax during the automated flight. Carlyle's head was turned slightly toward the center console, her eyes closed, her face showing the same peaceful expression that marked every victim throughout the aircraft. The autopilot controls showed engaged status. The flight management computer had executed its programmed sequence perfectly, and every switch and dial on the instrument panels remained in the positions appropriate for a completed flight. Medical personnel, who followed the firefighters inside, began the grim process of confirming what was already apparent. They moved from passenger to passenger, checking for vital signs that would not be found, searching for any indication of how death had come to claim every soul aboard. Skin temperatures suggested death had occurred within the past few hours, placing it somewhere over the middle states, while the aircraft was still hours from its destination. Rigor mortis had not yet set in, giving the bodies a disturbing appearance of recent life, as though any moment someone might open their eyes or shift position. But no one did. The scene was unprecedented in aviation history, and those present understood immediately that they were looking at something that should not exist. Commercial aircraft did not continue flying after losing their entire crew. Passengers did not die simultaneously without leaving evidence of cause. Bodies did not remain peacefully seated through whatever catastrophe had occurred. Yet here was a cabin full of people who had died together, apparently without warning or struggle, while the aircraft itself continued operating with mechanical indifference to the tragedy it carried. Chen stood near the cockpit door and looked back down the length of the cabin, taking in the full scope of what had been found. 121 people sat in their assigned seats, every one of them dead, every one of them appearing as though they had simply fallen asleep and never awakened. The overhead lights still burned, the air conditioning still circulated air through a space where no one breathed, and the emergency equipment that should have saved lives hung unused in its proper locations. The aircraft had delivered its passengers to Boston exactly on schedule, exactly as planned, but it had delivered them as corpses in a flying tomb that had somehow landed itself. Within hours, the aircraft had been towed to a secure hangar at the far edge of Logan International, its interior transformed into what investigators would treat as both crime scene and accident site, every detail requiring documentation before a single body could be moved or any evidence disturbed. The massive hangar doors rolled closed behind the 757, sealing it away from public view and creating a controlled environment where the painstaking work of investigation could begin. Outside, media trucks were already gathering at the airport perimeter, their satellite dishes rising like flowers seeking sun. But inside the hangar, a different kind of attention focused on the aircraft with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The agencies arrived in waves throughout the afternoon and evening. National Transportation Safety Board investigators came first, their team leaders establishing protocols and designating areas of responsibility before anyone else entered the cabin. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents followed, uncertain whether they were looking at mass murder or inexplicable accident, but required by law to investigate until criminal activity could be ruled out. Medical examiners from Massachusetts arrived with portable equipment and a fleet of transport vehicles, prepared for the grim task of eventually removing 121 bodies. Representatives from the airline, the aircraft manufacturer, and the pilots' union joined the growing crowd of officials, each group having their own interests and expertise to contribute to what was already shaping up as the most complex aviation investigation in American history. Jurisdictional questions consumed the first hours. Was this primarily a criminal matter requiring FBI oversight, or an accident investigation under NTSB authority? The absence of any apparent crime, no bomb damage, no bullet holes, no evidence of hijacking, suggested the latter, but the inexplicable nature of the deaths left room for criminal possibilities that could not yet be excluded. Eventually, a compromise emerged, with NTSB taking the lead on aircraft systems and flight operations, while FBI maintained authority over potential criminal aspects, and the medical examiner's office controlled the handling of remains. The decision satisfied no one completely, but allowed work to proceed, while bureaucratic territories remained technically disputed. Photography teams entered the cabin first, their equipment creating a constant rhythm of clicks and flashes as they documented every angle of every row. Wide shots captured the overall scene, medium shots showed sections of cabin, and close-ups recorded individual passengers in their final positions. Each photograph was logged with seat number, timestamp, and photographer identification, building a visual record that would eventually fill dozens of hard drives and allow investigators to virtually revisit the scene long after the aircraft had been emptied. The photographers worked in silence, their usual professional detachment strained by the peaceful faces they framed through their viewfinders. Air quality specialists moved through the cabin with sensitive instruments, collecting samples from different locations and altitudes within the fuselage. They drew air into sealed containers, scraped residue from surfaces, and used swabs to collect material from seats, walls, and overhead compartments. Every sample received a unique identifier and chain of custody documentation, ensuring that if any foreign substance was present, its exact location and concentration could be established. The environmental control system's filters were carefully removed and bagged, their contents potentially holding traces of whatever the passengers had breathed during their final hours. Pressure and temperature sensors were positioned throughout the cabin, recording the current conditions and comparing them against the aircraft's own data logs. Oxygen levels were measured and found to be normal for a sealed aircraft at ground level. But what those levels had been during flight remained a question that the aircraft systems might or might not be able to answer. Every gauge, every display, every control surface position was photographed and recorded, building a technical portrait of the aircraft's state that could later be analysed for the smallest abnormality. The bodies remained untouched through all of this, sitting in their seats as the investigation swirled around them. Regulations prohibited moving remains before documentation was complete, and the medical examiner was adamant that positions, clothing, and the relationship between passengers needed recording before anyone disturbed the scene. A young mother still held her infant in row 18, the baby's head resting against her shoulder in the eternal posture of parental comfort. The elderly couple near the rear remained with their hands clasped together, their final gesture of connection preserved by death's sudden arrival. Each position told a story of interrupted life, and those stories needed capturing before the necessary work of removal began. Hours stretched into the night as teams rotated through the hangar, each group adding their observations and samples to the growing mountain of data. Investigators moved with careful deliberation, aware that they might never have another opportunity to study the scene in its undisturbed state. Questions multiplied faster than answers, and the sheer volume of unknown variables threatened to overwhelm the structured protocols that normally guided such work. But the protocols continued, methodical and thorough, because in the absence of obvious explanation, the only path forward lay in examining everything and hoping that somewhere in the accumulated detail a pattern would emerge. By the time the first night ended and pale morning light began filtering through the hangar's high windows, the initial documentation phase was complete. Teams had catalogued, photographed, and sampled everything they could reach without disturbing the bodies, and now the medical examiner gave permission for the next phase to begin. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the chief medical examiner for Suffolk County, had performed autopsies on more than 3,000 individuals during her 27 years in forensic pathology, but she had never encountered bodies that appeared so thoroughly, impossibly normal, while being undeniably dead. The first external examinations took place in a temporary morgue established in an adjacent hangar, where tables had been arranged in rows and portable refrigeration units hummed against the walls. Teams of pathologists and technicians worked under bright lights, their movements careful and professional, as they began the process of examining 121 people who had died without leaving any obvious trace of how or why. The initial findings were striking in their consistency. No visible injuries marked any of the bodies. No bruising, no lacerations, no burns, no signs of physical trauma of any kind. Skin appeared healthy, with normal colour for the hours since death, showing none of the pallor or discoloration that might suggest poisoning or oxygen deprivation. Eyes, when examined, showed clear corneas and normal pupils. Mouths revealed no foam, no blood, no indication of choking or aspiration. Hands showed no defensive wounds, no scratches or broken nails that might suggest struggle. The bodies looked, in every external respect, like people who had simply fallen asleep and failed to wake. Internal. Examinations began with a representative sample of 20 victims, selected to provide a cross-section of age, sex, and seating location throughout the aircraft. Dr. Reeves herself performed the autopsy on Captain Rhodes, hoping that the pilot's examination might reveal exposure to some cockpit-specific hazard. The procedure followed standard protocols, each step documented with photographs and detailed notes, every organ examined and weighed, tissue samples preserved for later analysis. What emerged was a portrait of a healthy 52-year-old male with no acute pathology. Rhodes's heart showed normal size and structure, its chambers free of clots or damage, its vessels clear of significant blockage. His lungs expanded normally when inflated during examination, their tissue pink and healthy, with no signs of edema, hemorrhage, or infection. The brain, removed and sectioned, revealed no stroke damage, no bleeding, no tumours or abnormalities. His liver showed normal architecture, his kidneys functioned properly until the moment they stopped, and his digestive system contained a partially digested breakfast that suggested death had occurred roughly 3 hours after his last meal. By every measure available to forensic pathology, Rhodes had been a healthy man until something caused every system in his body to simultaneously cease functioning. The pattern repeated across every autopsy performed. A 34-year-old businesswoman in seat 7B showed a healthy heart, clear lungs, and a brain without injury. An 8-year-old boy from row 12 had organs that appeared perfect for his age, developing normally until the instant they stopped. The elderly man from row 27 showed age-appropriate changes, some arthritis, minor cardiac calcification, but nothing that explained sudden death. let alone simultaneous death with everyone around him. Each examination added to a growing portrait of medical impossibility. 121 people with functioning organs and healthy tissue who were nonetheless dead. Toxicology screens were ordered on every victim, and the samples went to multiple laboratories to ensure accuracy and eliminate any possibility of error. Blood, urine, and tissue samples were tested for thousands of compounds, including common poisons, industrial chemicals, biological toxins, and pharmaceutical agents. The screens looked for carbon monoxide, cyanide, organophosphates, heavy metals, and a comprehensive list of substances that might cause sudden death. Results came back over the following week, and each report showed the same findings: negative for toxins, negative for drugs beyond prescribed medications at therapeutic levels, negative for any foreign substance that might explain the deaths. Oxygen levels in the blood presented another puzzle. Post-mortem blood analysis showed hemoglobin saturation consistent with normal breathing at cruise altitude in a pressurized cabin. The victims had not suffocated, had not experienced hypoxia, and had not been deprived of air in any detectable way. Their blood carried oxygen right up until their heart stopped pumping it, and nothing in the cellular structure suggested why those hearts had ceased beating. Lung tissue showed no damage from toxic gases, no inflammation from inhaled irritants, and no indication of pulmonary embolism or other acute respiratory catastrophe. Neurological examination proved equally baffling. Brain tissue from multiple victims was sectioned and examined under microscopes by neuropathologists searching for any anomaly that might indicate stroke, seizure, or other acute event. The tissue appeared normal. No bleeding, no signs of increased pressure, no indication of electrical storm activity that might suggest simultaneous seizures. The brainstem, which controls automatic functions like breathing and heartbeat, showed no damage or abnormality. Whatever had stopped these people from living had left no mark on the organ that governed their most basic functions. Time of death estimates, based on body temperature, rigor mortis progression, and other standard indicators, placed all deaths within a 10 to 15 minute window somewhere over western Kansas, roughly 90 minutes into the flight. The precision of this finding was itself unusual. Mass casualty events typically showed variation in time of death, as individuals succumbed at different rates to whatever threatened them. But these victims appeared to have died nearly simultaneously, their bodies ceasing function within minutes of each other for reasons that left no physical evidence. Dr. Reeves consulted with specialists from major medical centres, sending tissue samples and case details to experts in cardiology, neurology, toxicology, and infectious disease. Each expert reviewed the findings and offered the same conclusion. Cause of death could not be determined from the available evidence. Some suggested additional tests, looking for exotic toxins or rare conditions, but each suggestion led to another negative result. The victims were not poisoned, not diseased, not injured, and not deprived of oxygen. They were simply dead, and medicine could not explain why. The final autopsy reports, filed 6 weeks after the incident, reflected an unprecedented medical reality. For 121 healthy individuals, ranging in age from 6 months to 87 years, the cause of death was listed as undetermined. The immediate cause, cardiac arrest, was noted, but that merely described the mechanism of death, not its cause. Heart stopped, breathing ceased, and brain function terminated, but what triggered that cascade in every person aboard remained beyond the reach of medical science to detect or explain. The aircraft stood in the hangar under harsh examination lights, while teams of engineers and inspectors crawled through every compartment, searching for the mechanical failure that must have occurred, yet finding none. Maintenance. Records had been pulled within hours of the incident, and they showed a Boeing 757 that had received all scheduled inspections on time, with no history of recurring problems or deferred repairs. The aircraft was 13 years old, middle-aged by commercial aviation standards, and its logbooks documented a service life that was unremarkable in its consistency and thoroughness. But documents alone could not answer the questions that needed asking, so the physical examination began with a comprehensiveness that bordered on obsessive. Structural engineers examined every inch of the fuselage, searching for cracks, corrosion, or fatigue that might indicate a failure in the pressure vessel. The 757's aluminum skin was inspected with both visual examination and ultrasonic testing, the latter capable of detecting flaws invisible to the naked eye. Inspection ports were opened along the length of the aircraft, allowing access to internal structures and frames that normally remained hidden behind interior panels. Stringers, longerons, and bulkheads were examined for signs of stress or damage. Teams spent days on this work, their reports documenting each section of fuselage with detailed measurements and photographs, and every report came back with the same conclusion. Structural integrity was intact. The pressurization system received particular attention, given that sudden decompression represented one of the few scenarios that might explain rapid incapacitation of everyone aboard. Engineers tested the outflow valves that controlled cabin pressure, examining their operation and checking for signs of malfunction. The system's sensors were removed and bench tested, their calibration verified against known standards. Inspection of the pressure vessel itself revealed no holes, no cracks, no breaches that would have allowed the aircraft's internal atmosphere to escape into the thin air at cruise altitude. The flight data recorder confirmed what the physical inspection suggested. Cabin pressure had remained stable throughout the flight, never deviating from the normal range that kept passengers comfortable at 35,000 feet. Environmental control systems came under similar scrutiny. The 757's air conditioning system drew bleed air from the engines, conditioned it for temperature and pressure, and distributed it throughout the cabin. Engineers traced the entire path of this air, from engine compressors through ducts and mixing chambers to the cabin distribution points. Each component was disassembled and examined. Filters were removed and analysed for contaminants. Heat exchangers were inspected for damage or blockage, and control valves were tested for proper operation. The system showed normal wear consistent with 13 years of service, but no failures, no blockages, and no indication that it had delivered anything other than properly conditioned air to the passengers. Oxygen systems were tested with particular care, though investigators knew that emergency oxygen masks had never deployed. The system included supplemental oxygen for the cockpit crew and drop-down masks for passengers, meant to provide breathable air if cabin pressure failed. Chemical generators that would have provided oxygen sat unused in their housings above each seat, their initiators unfired. The cockpit's oxygen bottles were found at full pressure, their regulators set correctly, their masks hanging unused on their brackets. Everything about the oxygen system suggested it had functioned normally throughout the flight, ready to provide emergency air that was never needed because cabin pressure never failed. The engines underwent tear-down inspections at the manufacturer's facility, their major components disassembled and examined by specialists who understood every aspect of turbofan operation. Compressor blades were measured for erosion and damage, turbine sections were inspected for cracks or thermal distress, and combustion chambers were examined for signs of abnormal operation. Oil analysis looked for metal particles that might indicate internal wear or failure. Both engines showed normal operating characteristics, their parts within acceptable tolerances, their performance parameters matching expectations for engines of their age and service history. Nothing suggested either engine had malfunctioned or produced anything abnormal during the fatal flight. Flight control systems were tested repeatedly, both through physical inspection and through simulation, using the aircraft's actual components. Hydraulic systems that moved control surfaces were examined for leaks, contamination, or failure. Electric motors and actuators were bench tested for proper operation. Computer systems that managed the autopilot were downloaded and analysed, their code examined line by line for anomalies or errors. Engineers recreated the flight in a simulator using the actual flight management computer from the incident aircraft, verifying that it had commanded the aircraft correctly through every phase from takeoff to landing. The autopilot had performed flawlessly, executing exactly what it was told to do, proving that the aircraft's computer systems were not at fault. Electrical systems received exhaustive examination. Batteries, generators, and wiring harnesses were inspected for faults that might have caused system failures or created hazardous conditions. Circuit breakers were tested, bus bars were examined for signs of arcing or overheating, and every connection point was inspected for corrosion or looseness. Electromagnetic interference testing looked for unusual fields or radiation that might have affected avionics or human physiology. The aircraft's electrical system showed no anomalies, no failures, and no indication of having produced anything that could harm passengers or crew. After 6 weeks of inspection, involving hundreds of engineers and thousands of work hours, the technical investigation reached its conclusion. The aircraft was mechanically sound before the flight, remained mechanically sound during the flight, and landed in a condition that would have allowed it to fly again immediately, if not for the bodies it carried. Every redundant system had functioned properly, every backup had remained ready if needed, and the aircraft itself had done exactly what it was designed to do. Whatever had killed 121 people, the aircraft was not responsible. Laboratory technicians in protective suits carefully analysed air samples taken from the sealed aircraft cabin, searching for the invisible killer that might explain how 121 people could die while breathing what appeared to be normal air. The samples had been collected within hours of the aircraft's landing, drawn from multiple locations throughout the cabin, and sealed in specialised containers that prevented any contamination or degradation. Each sample represented a snapshot of the atmosphere that the passengers had breathed during their final hours, and if some toxic substance had been present, these samples should reveal it. Gas chromatography separated the air into its constituent components, and mass spectrometry identified each substance with precision measured in parts per billion. The results showed exactly what should be present in commercial aircraft cabin air: nitrogen at roughly 78%, oxygen at 21%, with trace amounts of carbon dioxide, argon, and water vapour. No toxic gases appeared in detectable quantities, no carbon monoxide, no hydrogen sulfide, no sulfur dioxide, no nitrogen oxides beyond normal trace levels. The air that had circulated through the cabin during the flight was, by every measure available to analytical chemistry, safe and breathable. Biological analysis searched for pathogens that might have caused rapid death through infection or toxic shock. Samples were cultured for bacteria, tested for viral particles, and examined for fungal spores or other biological agents. Specialized tests looked for anthrax spores, ricin toxin, and other biological weapons that might have been deliberately introduced. Every test came back negative. No infectious agents, no biological toxins, no indication that anything living or recently living had contaminated the cabin air. The atmosphere aboard Flight 1713 had been biologically sterile beyond the normal human microbiome. Chemical weapons specialists examined the samples and the aircraft itself for traces of nerve agents, choking agents, and other military compounds designed to incapacitate or kill. These substances often left residues on surfaces or formed byproducts that could be detected long after exposure. Swabs taken from seats, walls, and air circulation grills were analysed for organophosphates, mustard agents, and dozens of other compounds. Nothing was found. The cabin showed no chemical signatures beyond the expected residues of cleaning products, hydraulic fluids, and other substances common to commercial aviation. Weather data from the flight's route was examined in exhaustive detail. Meteorologists reconstructed the atmospheric conditions along every mile of the journey, looking for unusual phenomena that might have affected the aircraft or its occupants. The flight had passed through clear skies with no significant weather systems, no thunderstorms, no unusual wind patterns. Temperature and pressure readings from multiple sources confirmed stable conditions throughout the flight path. If the atmosphere had done something to the aircraft, it had left no trace in the meteorological record. Radiation levels received particular attention after initial reports suggested this as a possible factor. Investigators contacted NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center to determine if any solar activity had occurred during the flight. The data showed no solar flares, no coronal mass ejections, and no unusual particle radiation events that might have affected aircraft at cruise altitude. Background cosmic radiation levels were checked and found to be within normal ranges for high-altitude flight. Dosimeters that some passengers had been carrying showed radiation exposure consistent with ordinary air travel, elevated slightly above ground level, but nowhere near dangerous thresholds. The flight path itself was analysed for proximity to any facilities or areas that might emit harmful substances. Military bases, nuclear facilities, chemical plants, and research laboratories were mapped along the route. The aircraft had passed near none of them closely enough for exposure to any potential emissions. No military testing had occurred in the area that day. No industrial accidents had released chemicals into the atmosphere, and no natural events like volcanic eruptions or gas releases had been reported. The airspace through which Flight 1713 had travelled was as ordinary as any in the country. Altitude profiles were examined with particular care, searching for any unusual variations that might have subjected passengers to dangerous conditions. The flight data recorder showed the aircraft had maintained its assigned altitude of 35,000 feet with only minor variations, none exceeding 50 feet in either direction. The autopilot had held the aircraft steady throughout the cruise phase, and cabin pressure had remained stable at an equivalent altitude of roughly 7,000 feet, well within the comfortable range for passengers. No sudden climbs or descents had occurred, no pressure variations that might have caused physical distress. Electromagnetic radiation surveys were conducted on the aircraft itself, searching for unusual fields or emissions that might have affected passengers. The aircraft's own systems generated electromagnetic fields, but these were well within safety limits and confined to specific areas around equipment. No unusual readings appeared anywhere in the cabin, no concentrated fields that might have interfered with human physiology. The electromagnetic environment aboard the aircraft was typical of any commercial airliner. Atmospheric scientists consulted by the investigation proposed various exotic scenarios involving rare meteorological phenomena. Temperature inversions, pressure waves, and unusual combinations of altitude and humidity were considered as possible factors. Each theory was tested against the actual conditions recorded during the flight, and each failed to match the data. The atmosphere through which the aircraft had flown was unremarkable in every measurable way, offering no explanation for what had occurred within the sealed cabin. After weeks of environmental analysis involving dozens of specialists and hundreds of tests, the conclusion was unavoidable. Nothing external had killed the passengers. The air was breathable, the radiation harmless, the weather benign, and the flight path unremarkable. The two orange boxes sat on the laboratory table, their cases scarred from years of service, but their contents intact and waiting to reveal what investigators hoped would be the key to the mystery. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder had been removed from the aircraft's tail section within hours of landing, their data preserved through the electronic equivalent of witness testimony. These devices recorded everything, every control input, every system parameter, every word spoken in the cockpit, and if any clue existed to explain what had happened aboard Flight 1713, it would be found in the information these boxes had faithfully captured throughout the flight. The flight data recorder yielded its information first, its digital memory downloaded and converted into readable formats that engineers could analyze. The data stream showed a flight that was perfect in every technical measure. Altitude remained stable at 35,000 feet, with variations of less than 30 feet, well within normal tolerances for autopilot operation. Airspeed held steady at the programmed cruise speed, varying by only a few knots, as the aircraft's systems compensated for minor wind changes. Heading tracked the flight plan with precision, the autopilot making small corrections to maintain the programmed route. Engine parameters showed both power plants operating in their normal ranges, fuel consumption matching predictions, and all monitored systems functioning exactly as designed. Control surface positions recorded throughout the flight showed the minor adjustments characteristic of autopilot operation. Small elevator movements maintained altitude, slight aileron inputs corrected for wind, and the rudder made tiny corrections to keep the aircraft coordinated. No unusual inputs appeared, no sudden movements that might indicate pilot intervention or system malfunction. The flight data recorder painted a picture of an aircraft flying itself smoothly and efficiently, its systems working in harmony to maintain stable flight, while the human occupants somehow ceased to exist as participants in the journey. Temperature and pressure readings from multiple sensors confirmed what other investigations had already determined. Cabin pressure remained stable throughout the flight, the environmental control system maintaining conditions equivalent to 7,000 feet altitude. Temperature stayed within the comfortable range, neither too hot nor too cold. Oxygen flow to the cabin showed normal patterns, the system delivering properly conditioned air at the correct rate. Every parameter that the flight data recorder monitored told the same story. This was a normal flight in every measurable way. The cockpit voice recorder analysis began with trepidation among the investigators, who understood they were about to hear the final words of men who had died without knowing why. The first 2 hours of the recording contained exactly what would be expected during a routine flight. Captain Rhodes and First Officer Carlyle went through their pre-flight checks with professional precision, their voices calm and occasionally punctuated by the small talk that helped pass time during standard procedures. Communications with air traffic control were crisp and proper, acknowledging clearances and confirming instructions with the economy of language that marked experienced pilots. The casual conversation between the pilots during the climb and early cruise phase covered ordinary topics. Rhodes mentioned his daughter's upcoming graduation, Carlyle discussed plans for her next vacation, and both commented on the smooth conditions and light load that made for an easy flight. Their voices carried the relaxed tone of professionals who had performed these tasks thousands of times, comfortable in their environment and confident in their aircraft. Nothing in their words or tone suggested any awareness of approaching danger. At 1 hour and 23 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft crossed from Colorado into Kansas, the tone began to shift. Rhodes' voice, still calm but with a note of curiosity, said something about the light outside. The exact words were difficult to make out, partially obscured by the cockpit's background sounds, but audio specialists who enhanced the recording heard what sounded like, "Do you see that ahead?" Carlyle responded affirmatively, her tone matching Rhodes's curious but not alarmed quality. For several seconds, only the ambient sounds of the cockpit filled the recording. The ventilation system, the subtle electronic tones of the instruments, the distant hum of the engines. Rhodes spoke again, this time more clearly. "What is that?" The question carried genuine puzzlement rather than concern. The voice of someone encountering something unexpected but not threatening. Carlyle's response was equally puzzled. "I don't know, it's like—" Her voice trailed off without completing the thought. More silence followed, broken only when someone, presumably Rhodes, said, "There's something wrong with the instruments." His tone had shifted slightly, still professional, but with an edge that suggested the first stirrings of concern rather than panic. The cockpit door chime sounded, indicating someone from the cabin wanted to enter. Rhodes acknowledged and the door apparently opened, though the mechanism made little sound on the recording. Susan Martinez's voice, professional and steady, said, "Captain, some of the passengers are asking about—" and then stopped mid-sentence. Rhodes asked, "About what?" but received no answer. The sound of movement, possibly footsteps, suggested someone entering or leaving the cockpit, but no further words from Martinez appeared on the recording. First Officer Carlyle spoke again, her voice now carrying a strange quality that audio analysts would later describe as distant or dreamy. "I feel—" she began, but never finished the statement. Rhodes responded with something that sounded like an acknowledgement or agreement, but his words were indistinct, as though speaking required effort he no longer possessed. A few more seconds of ambient cockpit sounds followed, and then came something that would puzzle investigators for months to come. A low-frequency sound, barely audible even after audio enhancement, appeared in the recording. It was not a sound from the aircraft's systems. Engineers who knew the 757 intimately could not identify any mechanism that would produce such a tone. The frequency analysis placed it below the normal range of human hearing, in the infrasound band that typically remained undetected by the ear but could sometimes be felt as a physical sensation. The sound lasted perhaps 15 seconds, its intensity building slightly before fading away completely, and during those seconds, no human voices appeared on the recording. After the sound vanished, only silence remained, not the silence of an empty room, but the peculiar quality of a space occupied by people who make no sound. The ventilation system continued its quiet rush. The instruments maintained their electronic whispers, and the engines droned on at their steady cruise power. But no voices, no movements, no signs of human presence disturbed the ambient sounds of the cockpit. The recording continued for another 2.5 hours, capturing every system sound and every automated chime as the aircraft flew itself toward Boston, landed, and finally shut down its engines on the taxiway. The black boxes that should have solved the mystery instead deepened it. The flight data recorder showed perfect operation of every system while everyone aboard died. The cockpit voice recorder captured fragments of confusion about something seen but never described, followed by a mysterious low-frequency sound that appeared from nowhere and corresponded with no known aircraft system or external source. Then came silence that lasted until the journey ended, not with answers, but with an automated landing that delivered the dead to their destination exactly on schedule. Among the personal belongings catalogued from the aircraft were dozens of smartphones, tablets, and cameras, many of which had been active during the flight, their digital records offering a fragmented, civilian perspective on the final minutes before silence fell. Forensic digital specialists handled each device with care, documenting battery levels, screen states, and any visible damage before attempting to access their contents. Some phones were locked behind passwords or biometric security, requiring legal authorization and specialized tools to bypass protections that their owners would never again use. Others had been left unlocked or in camera mode, their screens dark but their memories full of the last images their operators had captured. The recovered video footage told a story that began with complete normalcy. A college student in row 15 had been recording a video message for friends back home, her face filling the frame as she talked about her conference in Boston and complained good-naturedly about the early departure time. Behind her, other passengers were visible in soft focus, reading and working on laptops in the typical tableau of modern air travel. The timestamp placed this recording at 1 hour and 12 minutes into the flight, and nothing in the frames suggested anything unusual was occurring. The student's monologue continued for another 3 minutes before the video ended, with her reaching forward to stop the recording. Her final words, a cheerful, "See you guys soon." A tourist in row 8 had been using his camera to photograph the landscape below, the high-resolution images capturing cloud formations and the patchwork geometry of farmland passing 35,000 feet beneath the aircraft. The photos showed clear skies and excellent visibility, with timestamps marching forward in regular intervals as the photographer worked through his hobby. Then at 1 hour and 19 minutes into the flight, the camera's orientation changed. Instead of pointing down through the window at the ground, subsequent photos showed the cabin interior, slightly blurred as though taken hastily, and in the background of these images, other passengers could be seen standing or leaning toward windows on the right side of the aircraft. Several passengers had captured what happened next, though none had framed it in a way that provided clear answers. A smartphone video from row 20 showed passengers across the aisle pointing towards something outside their windows, their faces showing curiosity rather than alarm. The person recording had been trying to see what drew their attention, the camera view swinging toward the windows, but the angle captured only the interior of the cabin and the sides of seats. Voices on the audio track asked questions. What is that? And do you see it? And is that another plane? The tone carried interest and puzzlement, but no fear. The questions casual enough that they might have been about unusual weather or an interesting landmark below. Another video, recorded by a passenger near the front of the cabin, showed a flight attendant moving down the aisle. The attendant's expression appeared focused but not alarmed, and she could be heard asking passengers to remain seated even as several stood to get a better view of whatever had caught everyone's attention. The video showed her glancing out a window herself, pausing for a moment as though studying something before continuing toward the cockpit. The recording continued for another 40 seconds, during which the cabin remained animated with passengers talking and craning to see, until the video abruptly ended mid-frame. The digital evidence showed that recording stopped gradually rather than simultaneously. Video timestamps indicated a span of roughly 2 to 3 minutes, during which various devices ceased capturing images. Some ended cleanly, as though their operators had deliberately stopped recording. Others simply froze mid-recording, their final frames showing ordinary cabin scenes that would remain the last images those devices ever captured. A few phones continued recording for several minutes more, their cameras pointed at seats or overhead bins or simply lying on tray tables, capturing unchanging views of cabin walls, their microphones picking up only the ambient hum of the aircraft, with no human voices to punctuate the mechanical sounds. Text messages recovered from several phones painted a picture of interrupted communication. A businessman in first class had been typing to his office. Flight smooth so far. Passengers looking at something outside. Weird light, I think. The message remained in draft form, never sent. A mother in row 18 had begun texting her husband. Kids doing great. Sleeping now. We just saw something And there the message ended. The final word incomplete, the woman's thumb apparently lifting from the screen before she could finish the thought. Social media applications showed similar fragments. Posts begun but never completed. Photos selected but never uploaded. Status updates composed but never shared. One particularly haunting find came from a teenager's phone, which had been recording a continuous video blog throughout much of the flight. The young woman had documented her breakfast, her complaints about the small seats, and her excitement about visiting colleges in Boston. At 1 hour and 22 minutes, she turned the camera toward her window, saying, "Everyone's looking at something. I can't really see what it..." And then the recording simply stopped. Not with the usual end of video marker, but as though the phone had been switched off or the application had crashed. Forensic examination showed no technical reason for the recording to have stopped at that moment. No low battery warning, no memory full notification, just an abrupt end to a file that should have continued. The devices offered glimpses, but no clarity, fragments of observation that raised more questions than they answered. Whatever the passengers saw, none had captured it in sufficient detail to allow later identification. The references to light, the pointing toward windows, the curiosity without panic, all of it suggested something visible but unexplained, something that drew attention without immediately triggering alarm. And then within minutes, every device fell silent as their operators ceased the activity of living. In the days following the incident, investigators interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, hoping someone on the ground had seen something that might explain the impossible. Air traffic controllers who had tracked the flight on radar, pilots who had been flying in nearby airspace, and civilians in the towns and farmland beneath the aircraft's route all received visits from federal agents carrying photographs and detailed questions. Each interview began with the same hope, that an external observer might have noticed what those aboard the aircraft could not report. Air traffic controllers at Denver Center, Kansas City Center, and Indianapolis Center provided the most detailed accounts of the flight's progress across the country. Their testimonies were consistent and professionally documented, supported by radar recordings and communication logs that captured every aspect of the flight's journey through their sectors. The controllers described a textbook flight that maintained its assigned altitude and heading with the precision of automated systems, never deviating from the programmed route. Radar returns showed a solid target moving at the expected speed, the transponder broadcasting normal information about altitude, airspeed, and aircraft identification. Until the radio went silent, nothing on their screens suggested anything amiss. Military radar operators confirmed what civilian controllers had observed. NORAD tracking stations had maintained awareness of the flight as part of their routine monitoring of commercial traffic, and their more sophisticated equipment had detected no anomalies. No other aircraft operated near Flight 1713 during the critical period. No unusual radar returns appeared in proximity to the flight path, and no electronic emissions beyond normal aircraft systems were detected by the military's sensitive receivers. The flight had crossed the country in airspace that was, from a surveillance perspective, completely unremarkable. Other pilots in the area that morning provided accounts that added visual detail to the radar picture. A cargo flight heading westbound at 37,000 feet had passed within 20 miles of Flight 1713, close enough for the crew to have visual contact. The cargo pilots reported seeing the commercial aircraft as a distant white speck against blue sky, flying straight and level with no visible abnormalities. No smoke trailed from the engines, no unusual lights appeared on the fuselage, and the aircraft's flight characteristics looked entirely normal to experienced eyes watching from miles away. The cargo crew mentioned seeing it and thinking nothing more of the encounter until they learned later what had occurred aboard that distant aircraft. Ground observers along the flight path offered more fragmentary testimony. Amateur aviation enthusiasts who photographed commercial flights as a hobby provided images of Flight 1713 passing overhead during its cruise phase. The photographs showed a normal-appearing 757 at altitude, its white fuselage catching sunlight, its wings level, and its engines producing the standard contrails one would expect at cruise altitude. Digital analysis of these photographs revealed no anomalies, no unusual features, and no indication that anything aboard was amiss. The aircraft looked like any of thousands of flights that crossed American skies each day. Farmers working in fields beneath the flight path in Kansas and Missouri were interviewed about what they might have observed. Most remembered seeing or hearing aircraft pass overhead that morning, though few could distinguish one flight from another in the constant parade of commercial traffic that crossed the central states. Those who did recall the specific time frame described hearing the usual sound of jet engines at altitude, that distant rumble that was part of the rural soundscape. Several mentioned that the morning had been unusually quiet, with less wind than typical, but none reported anything that struck them as unusual or worthy of particular attention. One witness stood apart from the others in his account. A retired airline pilot living near the Kansas-Missouri border claimed to have been watching the flight through binoculars when he noticed what he described as a shimmer around the aircraft. He struggled to articulate exactly what he meant, comparing it to heat waves rising from hot pavement, but noting that the effect seemed to envelope the entire aircraft for a brief period. He estimated the phenomenon lasted perhaps 30 seconds before fading, and during that time, the aircraft continued flying normally. His account was detailed and sincere, but investigators could find no corroborating witnesses despite intensive searches for others who might have been watching the sky at that moment. Weather observers at stations along the flight path reported conditions that matched the meteorological data already collected. Clear skies, light winds, no unusual atmospheric phenomena. The morning had been characterized by stable air and excellent visibility, the kind of conditions pilots considered ideal for flight. No one reported strange lights, unusual cloud formations, or atmospheric effects that might correspond with the time and location of the incident. The sky through which Flight 1713 had travelled appeared by all terrestrial observations to be utterly ordinary. Military pilots who had intercepted the aircraft over Kansas provided perhaps the most detailed ground-based observations, though technically they were airborne at the time. Their reports emphasized the normalcy of the aircraft's appearance from outside. Paint scheme intact, no visible damage, engines operating smoothly, and flight control surfaces in appropriate positions for level cruise flight. They had flown close enough to see into the cockpit windows, though the tinted glass and cockpit lighting made it difficult to observe details of what was inside. Neither pilot reported seeing anything that would have prompted concern if they had encountered the aircraft under different circumstances. From every external vantage point, Flight 1713 had appeared completely normal. Ground observers, radar operators, and nearby pilots all described an unremarkable commercial flight proceeding routinely across the country. Whatever had killed 121 people did so invisibly, leaving no trace visible to the world watching from below or beside. The 121 names on the passenger manifest represented 121 separate lives, each with their own reasons for being aboard that flight, and investigators spent weeks tracing each biography, hoping to find the common thread that might explain why these particular people had been chosen, if chosen they were. Federal agents conducted comprehensive background investigations on every passenger and crew member, pulling credit reports, employment histories, medical records, and travel patterns. They interviewed friends, family members, colleagues, and neighbours, building detailed profiles that would reveal any connections, any patterns, any reason why these specific individuals might have been targeted or particularly vulnerable to whatever had occurred at 35,000 feet. The passengers came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. They ranged in age from a 6-month-old infant travelling with her mother to an 87-year-old retired professor heading to visit his grandchildren. 17 different states were represented in their addresses, along with 3 foreign countries. Occupations spanned the spectrum of American society: software engineers and construction workers, teachers and accountants, students and retirees, a veterinarian, a jazz musician, 2 attorneys, and a commercial fisherman. Some were wealthy, others lived paycheck to paycheck, and most occupied the broad middle ground of comfortable but not extravagant circumstances. Their reasons for travel were equally varied: business trips, family visits, vacations, college tours, medical appointments, and simple desire for change of scenery. Investigators searched exhaustively for connections between passengers, Did any know each other before the flight? Had any worked for the same companies, attended the same schools, or lived in the same cities at any point in their lives? Advanced database searches and social network analysis looked for even the most tenuous links. The results showed what one would expect from any random group of air travellers: a few coincidental connections that meant nothing. 2 passengers had attended different colleges in the same city 15 years apart. 3 had accounts at the same national bank, along with millions of other customers. The businessman in seat 4A and the teacher in row 23 had both visited the same beach resort in Florida, though in different years and different seasons. These were the connections that exist in any large enough sample, mathematical coincidences rather than meaningful patterns. The crew received even more intensive scrutiny. Captain Rhodes had been with the airline for 22 years, his record unmarked by incidents or complaints. First Officer Carlisle had 11 years of experience, including military service before her commercial career. The 4 flight attendants ranged from 3 to 15 years of service, all with clean employment records and no disciplinary actions. Financial investigations revealed no unusual debt, no large deposits that might suggest payments for illicit activity, and no connections to criminal enterprises. Their personal lives appeared stable and unremarkable. Rhodes was married with 2 children, Carlisle was engaged to be married in the coming autumn, and the flight attendants maintained the typical, busy lives of airline crew members, with apartments near major airports and schedules that rotated through different routes and aircraft types. Medical histories of all passengers and crew were examined with particular attention to any conditions that might make them vulnerable to sudden death. The investigation revealed the typical distribution one would expect in any random population. Several passengers took medications for high blood pressure or cholesterol, conditions managed successfully for years. 2 were diabetic, their insulin and monitoring supplies found in their carry-on luggage. 1 teenager took medication for attention deficit disorder. An elderly passenger used an inhaler for mild asthma, but none of these conditions, individually or in aggregate, explained sudden simultaneous death. The medications they took were common, prescribed to millions, and none shared the same prescriptions that might suggest a contaminated batch or pharmaceutical connection. Allergy records showed similar randomness. Some passengers were allergic to specific foods or medications, but no common allergen appeared in their medical histories. The air samples from the aircraft had been tested for every known airborne allergen, and none had been present in quantities that would cause reactions, let alone fatal ones. No one aboard was known to be allergic to anything related to aircraft operations. No sensitivity to hydraulic fluids, no reactions to cabin air, no problems with the materials used in aircraft construction. Their allergies were individual and varied, ranging from pollen to shellfish to penicillin, with no pattern that suggested vulnerability to a common threat. The search for enemies or threats yielded nothing. None of the passengers were subjects of ongoing criminal investigations. None had received threats or expressed fear for their safety before departure. Security screenings showed no one on terrorism watch lists, no connections to extremist organizations, and no suspicious travel patterns to regions of concern. The most suspicious finding in weeks of investigation was a passenger who had been arrested for drunk driving 6 years earlier, a transgression that had no bearing on the current incident. This was not a flight targeted for its passengers. It was simply a flight that happened to carry people whose only commonality was their decision to fly from Denver to Boston on that particular morning. Family interviews painted portraits of ordinary departures. Spouses described routine goodbyes. Children talked about parents leaving on typical business trips, and friends recounted casual conversations about upcoming travel. No one reported unusual behaviour, premonitions of danger, or reluctance to board the flight. The departures were marked by the mundane details that characterise most travel. Reminders about picking up milk on the way home, promises to call when landing, discussions of what to bring as gifts. These were people who expected to return, who made plans that extended beyond the flight, who had no reason to believe this journey would be any different from the hundreds of flights they had taken before. Statistical analysts examined every conceivable pattern. Did seat numbers correlate with any factor? Were certain demographics overrepresented? Did ticket purchase dates cluster in meaningful ways? Was there a pattern in when passengers checked in or chose their seats? The analysis revealed perfect randomness, which itself seemed impossible until one remembered that true randomness often looks suspicious to human pattern-seeking minds. Dr. Marcus Chen, a physicist specializing in atmospheric electromagnetic phenomena, was not typically consulted on aviation incidents, but when every conventional explanation had been exhausted, investigators began listening to voices from the margins of accepted science. Chen's work focused on rare electromagnetic events in the upper atmosphere, phenomena that occurred too infrequently to be well documented, but that might, under specific conditions, affect aircraft and their occupants. His theory centered on the possibility that Flight 1713 had encountered a natural electromagnetic pulse, similar to those produced by lightning, but operating at frequencies and intensities not typically measured or understood. Such a pulse might affect biological systems without leaving traces on electronic equipment, particularly if it operated in specific frequency bands to which human neural tissue was vulnerable. The theory had precedents in nature. Whales sometimes beach themselves in mass strandings that researchers attributed to disruption of their navigation systems by underwater acoustic phenomena. Birds occasionally fell from the sky in large numbers, their deaths linked to atmospheric conditions that affected their internal compasses. If electromagnetic or acoustic energy could disorient and kill animals at specific frequencies, perhaps something similar could affect humans. Chen pointed to the low-frequency sound detected on the cockpit voice recorder as potential evidence, though he acknowledged that the recording showed effect rather than cause, capturing something that had already begun rather than identifying its source. The challenge with Chen's electromagnetic theory lay in the aircraft's electronics, which had continued functioning perfectly. A pulse strong enough to disrupt human neural activity should have affected the aircraft's sensitive systems, causing glitches or failures in navigation equipment, communication systems, or flight controls. Yet the flight data recorder showed no such anomalies. Chen modified his theory to suggest that the frequency might have been precisely tuned to affect organic tissue while leaving solid-state electronics untouched, but this required assumptions about electromagnetic effects that had little experimental support. Tests on similar aircraft attempting to reproduce such selective effects yielded negative results. Other researchers proposed infrasound as the mechanism of death. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, an acoustic specialist, noted that low-frequency sound below the threshold of human hearing could cause physical effects ranging from disorientation to organ damage. Certain frequencies could induce resonance in body cavities, potentially disrupting heart rhythm or breathing patterns. The human body contains structures that might vibrate sympathetically with infrasound at specific frequencies, and if an external source produced such sound at sufficient intensity, it could theoretically affect everyone in an enclosed space simultaneously. The mysterious low-frequency sound on the cockpit recorder seemed to support this theory, offering tantalizing evidence of an acoustic event coinciding with the deaths. Whitmore's theory faced significant obstacles when subjected to analysis. The aircraft's engines and environmental systems were examined for their capability to produce infrasound at lethal intensities. While turbofan engines did produce low-frequency noise, the levels were well within safe ranges and had been for the entire flight history of the aircraft type. No malfunction could be identified that would have changed this output, and other 757s flying similar profiles showed no unusual acoustic signatures. External sources of infrasound were considered: atmospheric phenomena, military testing, even seismic activity, but none could be correlated with the flight's location and timing. The infrasound theory explained the recorded anomaly, but failed to identify a source for that sound. Atmospheric scientists proposed theories involving rare pressure waves or temperature inversions that might create localized zones of unusual conditions. Dr. James Morrison suggested that the aircraft might have passed through a region where atmospheric pressure varied in ways not captured by standard meteorological measurements. Such pressure variations, if severe enough and changing rapidly enough, could theoretically affect human physiology while leaving the aircraft's pressurization system struggling to compensate. The body's response to pressure changes operated on different timescales than mechanical systems, and perhaps some combination of altitude, pressure, and rate of change had created conditions that overwhelmed human adaptive capacity. This theory required coincidences that troubled even its proponents. The atmospheric conditions would have needed to be both severe and precisely localized, affecting only the volume of space occupied by the aircraft during its passage. Weather data from the flight path showed no evidence of such conditions, though Morrison argued that current monitoring might not detect phenomena operating on very small scales or brief durations. Attempts to model conditions that would produce the required effect suggested they would also cause detectable disturbances in the aircraft's flight characteristics. Yet the flight data showed perfect stability throughout the critical period. Fringe quantum physicists, venturing into territory that made mainstream scientists uncomfortable, spoke of decoherence events or localized breakdowns in the patterns that maintained conscious awareness. These theories operated at the boundary of speculation and pseudoscience, proposing that consciousness itself might be a quantum phenomenon that could be disrupted by the right combination of electromagnetic fields, gravitational effects, or other poorly understood influences. Such ideas could never be tested or falsified using current methods, making them intellectually unsatisfying even to those who proposed them. Yet they offered a framework, however tenuous, for thinking about simultaneous cessation of consciousness in a group of people with no apparent physical cause. Each unconventional theory brought something to the discussion while failing to provide complete explanation. The electromagnetic theory accounted for the simultaneous nature of the deaths, but could not explain why the aircraft systems remained unaffected. The infrasound theory explained the acoustic anomaly, but lacked a source. The atmospheric pressure theory required conditions that should have left other traces. The quantum theories, while intriguing, operated in realms where experimental verification was impossible with current technology. Within days of the incident becoming public knowledge, the story dominated headlines worldwide, transforming from an aviation mystery into a cultural phenomenon that spawned countless theories, debates, and fears about the nature of death itself. The initial reports had been factual and restrained. Wire services describing a commercial aircraft that had landed with all aboard found dead, cause unknown, investigation ongoing. But as hours turned to days and the investigation produced no clear answers, the coverage intensified with a hunger that seemed to grow in proportion to the mystery's resistance to explanation. Television networks devoted segments and then entire programs to the incident, cycling through the same limited facts while filling airtime with speculation from experts who had no more answers than anyone else. Aviation specialists appeared on news programs to discuss possible scenarios, their hypotheses growing more elaborate as conventional explanations were ruled out one by one. Medical experts offered theories about sudden illness or toxic exposure, their confidence in each explanation diminishing when they learned that autopsies had found nothing. Former accident investigators analysed what little information had been released publicly, building frameworks of possibility on foundations of insufficient data. Each expert brought credentials and experience, but none brought certainty, and the cumulative effect of their television appearances was to demonstrate how completely the incident defied professional understanding. Online theories multiplied with the speed and fertility that only internet communities could provide. Forums dedicated to aviation mysteries filled with detailed speculation, some based on careful analysis of known facts, most extrapolating wildly from fragments of information. Terrorism remained a popular theory, despite the FBI's statements that no evidence supported it, the absence of proof somehow failing to diminish belief among those convinced that official denials meant official cover-up. Biological weapons testing appeared in numerous posts, complete with elaborate scenarios involving government experiments gone wrong or deliberate attacks by foreign powers. Each theory found adherents who defended it passionately, constructing increasingly complex narratives to explain away contradicting evidence. Supernatural explanations flourished in corners of the internet, where scientific restraint held less sway. Some claimed the flight had been taken by alien beings, the passengers abducted, and their bodies returned to create the illusion of natural death. Religious groups suggested divine intervention, pointing to various passengers as either righteous souls called home or sinners struck down for unnamed transgressions. A few voices proposed that the incident represented some form of rapture, though theological scholars from various faiths quickly dismissed such interpretations as having no basis in scripture or doctrine. The theories shared a common feature. They all sought to impose meaning on an event that seemed to resist meaning, filling the void of explanation with stories that satisfied emotional needs, even when they satisfied no evidentiary standards. The aviation community responded to the incident with deep concern that manifested in ways both practical and paranoid. Airlines faced questions from passengers about safety measures, as if any measure could guard against an unknown threat. Pilots discussed the incident in crew rooms and online forums, their conversations marked by the unsettled feeling that comes when professionals encounter something that should not exist within their domain of expertise. Some passengers refused to fly in the weeks following the incident, particularly those who had been booked on similar aircraft or routes. The Boeing 757, a workhorse of commercial aviation with an exemplary safety record, found itself temporarily viewed with suspicion, as though the aircraft type itself might harbour some fatal flaw despite decades of reliable service. Media pressure on the investigation intensified as public interest showed no sign of waning. Reporters camped outside NTSB offices, ambushed investigators leaving work, and filed Freedom of Information requests for documents that were still being created. The families of victims found themselves besieged by journalists seeking interviews, their grief compounded by the constant intrusion of cameras and microphones. Some families spoke publicly. Their pleas for privacy and appeals for continued investigation aired on evening news programs before being replayed endlessly online. Others retreated from view entirely, refusing all contact with media and changing phone numbers to escape the relentless pursuit of their stories. Documentary filmmakers announced projects before the investigation had concluded, their proposals promising to reveal truths that investigators had supposedly missed or hidden. Publishers rushed to sign authors who claimed insider knowledge or unique insights, despite most having no connection to the case beyond proximity to tragedy. The marketplace treated the incident as content to be packaged and sold, and the machinery of media production ground forward regardless of whether actual answers existed to be revealed. Families watched strangers profit from their loss, while they themselves struggled with grief, made more difficult by the absence of explanation. The official investigators, bound by protocols that prohibited discussing ongoing investigations, could offer little to satisfy the media's appetite for information. Their silence, professionally appropriate and legally mandated, created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. The document ran to 847 pages, detailed every aspect of the investigation in exhaustive technical language, and arrived at a conclusion that satisfied no one. After 12 months of investigation, involving hundreds of specialists and thousands of work hours, the cause of the incident could not be determined. The National Transportation Safety Board released a preliminary report on September 14, 2004, exactly 1 year after Flight 1713 had departed Denver, with 121 people who would never reach their destination alive. The report's release was handled with formal ceremony at NTSB headquarters in Washington, the board chairman reading a prepared statement to assembled media before taking limited questions that he answered with careful precision, each response emphasizing the thoroughness of the investigation while acknowledging its ultimate failure to identify a cause. The executive summary, written for public consumption, laid out the basic facts in language stripped of technical jargon. The aircraft had been mechanically sound, its maintenance current, its systems functioning properly throughout the flight. The crew had been qualified and experienced, showing no signs of impairment or error. Weather conditions had been benign, with no atmospheric phenomena that might have affected the flight. All passengers and crew had died simultaneously during cruise flight for reasons that medical examination could not determine. The aircraft had continued flying under autopilot control and had landed successfully at its destination. No evidence of criminal activity, terrorism, or sabotage had been found. The investigation remained open, with periodic reviews planned to assess any new evidence or analytical techniques that might shed light on the incident. The full technical report contained appendices that documented every aspect of the investigation in minute detail. Metallurgical analysis of engine components filled dozens of pages with measurements and photographs. Toxicology reports listed thousands of compounds tested for and not found in victim tissues. Air quality analyses detailed the chemical composition of cabin atmosphere to parts per billion. Maintenance records were reproduced in full, showing every inspection and repair performed on the aircraft throughout its service life. The report included transcripts of interviews with hundreds of witnesses, though many names were redacted to protect privacy. Photographs documented the aircraft interior, the peaceful positions of the victims, and the normal appearance of all systems and controls. Key findings were presented in categorical sections that read like an inventory of negatives. Aircraft systems, no mechanical failures detected. Environmental factors, no toxic substances, no radiation, no atmospheric anomalies. Medical examination, no infectious disease, no poisoning, no physical trauma. Crew performance, no evidence of error or impairment. The report noted that all conventional investigative avenues had been pursued to their conclusions, and each had ended without providing explanation for the deaths. Unconventional theories proposed by outside researchers were acknowledged in a separate section that treated them with respectful skepticism, noting that while interesting, none had evidentiary support sufficient to establish causation. The report's recommendations section struggled to propose meaningful changes based on an incident, whose cause remained unknown. Enhanced monitoring of aircraft systems was suggested, though investigators acknowledged this would not have prevented the incident, since existing monitoring had shown all systems functioning normally. Additional medical screening for pilots and crew was proposed, despite no evidence that any pre-existing condition had contributed to the deaths. The recommendations felt perfunctory, gestures toward the requirement that investigation reports must offer paths forward even when no clear path exists. The most honest recommendation was the final one: continued research into rare phenomena that might cause sudden mass mortality and international cooperation to share information about similar incidents should they occur elsewhere. Public and media reaction to the report's release ranged from frustration to anger, with some commentators accusing the investigation of incompetence, while others suggested cover-up. Aviation safety advocates pointed to the lack of actionable recommendations as evidence that the investigation had failed its primary mission. Families of victims expressed disappointment that a year of waiting had produced no answers, though some acknowledged publicly that they understood the investigators had done everything possible with the evidence available. Conspiracy theorists seized on the report's inconclusiveness as proof of deliberate concealment, their arguments impervious to the simpler explanation that some mysteries resist solution despite best efforts. Professional reaction from within the investigative community was more measured. Fellow accident investigators recognized the quality and thoroughness of the work, understanding that an inconclusive result reflected the nature of the incident rather than investigative failure. The report became a case study in how to document the undocumentable, how to present negative findings with the same rigor typically reserved for positive ones. Aviation medicine specialists noted that the medical investigation had been exemplary in its comprehensiveness, even though it had found nothing. The report stood as testament to what happens when rigorous methodology encounters something that exists outside the framework that methodology was designed to address. The official conclusion, repeated in multiple sections of the report, used careful language that avoided both certainty and speculation. The deaths of 121 people aboard Flight 1713 could not be attributed to any known cause based on available evidence and current scientific understanding. Dr. Helen Marchetti, a researcher specializing in unexplained mass mortality events, began compiling a database of similar incidents throughout history, and what emerged was a disturbing pattern of cases where groups of people died simultaneously without clear cause. Their deaths as inexplicable as those aboard Flight 1713. Her research stretched back more than a century, pulling from maritime records, colonial archives, and aviation incident reports that had been filed and largely forgotten in the decades before digital databases made pattern recognition possible. The cases she identified shared certain characteristics: sudden death affecting entire groups, peaceful appearance of the victims, absence of obvious cause, and investigations that ended without satisfactory explanation. Maritime history provided several accounts that bore uncomfortable similarities to the flight. In 1872, the merchant vessel Mary Celeste was found adrift in the Atlantic with no crew aboard, though that case involved disappearance rather than death and remained distinct from what Marchetti sought. More relevant was the Norwegian cargo ship Urang Medan, reportedly found in 1948 with its entire crew dead at their posts, faces frozen in expressions described as terrified, yet showing no physical injuries. The incident was documented in maritime registries, though details remained sparse and some historians questioned whether the event had occurred exactly as reported. If the accounts were accurate, the crew had died together without apparent cause, leaving only their ship to tell a story it could not articulate. Isolated communities offered additional examples. A mining settlement in northern Canada experienced an incident in 1923 where 17 workers were found dead in their barracks one winter morning, all apparently having died during the night. Medical examination at the time found no carbon monoxide poisoning, no infectious disease, and no signs of violence. The investigation attributed the deaths to unknown causes, and the settlement was abandoned shortly after, the remaining miners unwilling to stay in a place that had claimed their colleagues so mysteriously. Records from the period were incomplete, but what survived suggested that the incident had deeply disturbed those who investigated it. A research station in Antarctica reported a similar event in 1959, though the incident remained classified for decades, and details emerged only through Freedom of Information Act requests filed years later. According to the released documents, 4 scientists at a remote observation post died simultaneously during a winter storm, their bodies found in positions suggesting normal activity interrupted by sudden death. The official explanation cited equipment failure leading to asphyxiation, but the equipment in question was found to be functioning properly when rescue teams arrived days later. The inconsistency was noted in internal memos but never publicly addressed. Previous aircraft incidents, while rare, existed in aviation history's darker corners. A small private plane in 1978 was found crashed in Montana wilderness, with all 4 occupants dead, but analysis suggested they had died before impact, the aircraft gliding until it struck a mountain. No cause of death was determined, despite autopsies. A military transport in 1965 had reportedly radioed confusion about crew members becoming unresponsive before the aircraft crashed, though classified status limited what could be known about the investigation's findings. These incidents differed from Flight 1713 in that the aircraft had not continued flying successfully, but the pattern of unexplained simultaneous death among occupants suggested some connection worth examining. Marchetti's analysis identified common elements across these disparate cases. All involved sudden onset affecting multiple people simultaneously. Victims appeared peaceful, suggesting death came without warning or struggle. Medical examinations, when conducted, found no consistent cause. Investigations typically ended inconclusively, with official reports citing unknown causes or equipment failures that evidence did not fully support. The incidents occurred in different eras, different locations, and different circumstances, yet they shared these troubling similarities that resisted conventional explanation. Statistical analysis of the compiled cases produced ambiguous results. The sample size was small, perhaps 24 well-documented incidents over more than a century, making pattern identification statistically problematic. Some researchers argued that such events occurred more frequently than reported, with many going undocumented or misattributed to other causes. Others suggested that the cases represented nothing more than coincidental clustering of rare but unrelated phenomena. The human mind's tendency to see patterns in randomness, creating connections where none existed. The debate could not be resolved with available data, leaving both interpretations plausible. Skeptics pointed out that historical documentation was often incomplete or unreliable, particularly for older incidents, where investigation techniques were less rigorous. They noted that missing information might have contained explanations that later researchers, working from fragmentary records, could not access. The tendency to sensationalize mysterious deaths might have transformed ordinary tragedies into supernatural puzzles through decades of retelling and embellishment. Each historical case, examined individually, contained gaps and uncertainties that made definitive conclusions impossible. Yet those who studied the patterns noted that the consistency across independent accounts suggested something beyond pure fabrication. Witnesses separated by decades and continents described remarkably similar phenomena without apparent knowledge of each other's reports. The peaceful appearance of victims appeared in accounts from 1920s Canada and 1950s Antarctica, from maritime incidents and aviation crashes, suggesting either a real pattern or a remarkably persistent form of collective imagination. The truth likely lay somewhere in the ambiguous space between these positions, neither fully confirming nor completely dismissing the possibility of recurring unexplained events. For the families and investigators connected to Flight 1713, these historical parallels offered cold comfort. If the incident was not unique, if similar events had occurred throughout history, then perhaps humanity faced a recurring phenomenon that periodically claimed lives through mechanisms science had not yet identified or understood. For the families of the 121 victims, the investigation's inability to determine cause of death created complications beyond emotional trauma, generating legal limbo, insurance disputes, and a form of grief made worse by the absence of explanation. The immediate aftermath had been chaotic, with notification processes handled by airline representatives trained for such duties, but unprepared for the unique circumstances of this incident. How does one explain to a waiting spouse or parent that their loved one has died, that everyone aboard has died, but that no one knows why? The notifications were delivered with as much compassion as could be mustered, but the words felt inadequate, the explanations hollow, and the promises that investigation would provide answers rang false even as they were spoken. Grief under normal circumstances follows patterns that therapists and counsellors understand, moving through stages that, while painful, represent a journey toward acceptance and healing. But the deaths aboard Flight 1713 disrupted these patterns in ways that left families struggling without roadmap or guidance. Denial became more difficult to overcome when medical science itself could not explain what had happened. Anger had no clear target, no drunk driver to blame, no negligent party to sue, no villain against whom rage could be directed productively. Bargaining was impossible when the mechanism of death remained unknown, offering no counterfactual scenario in which different choices might have prevented the tragedy. The absence of explanation transformed grief into something more complex and intractable. Legal complications emerged almost immediately. Death certificates required a cause of death, but medical examiners had none to provide. After consultation with legal authorities, certificates were eventually issued, listing cause as undetermined, a designation that created problems with insurance companies, estate settlements, and various bureaucratic processes that assumed death always had identifiable causes. Some insurance providers initially questioned whether they were obligated to pay life insurance claims when cause of death could not be established, their lawyers exploring whether the policy's language provided escape clauses for such unprecedented circumstances. Public pressure and threat of litigation eventually resolved most of these disputes in favour of the families, but the delays added financial stress to emotional burden. Airline liability presented another legal quagmire. Under normal circumstances, when mechanical failure or pilot error caused deaths, responsibility could be assigned and compensation determined through established frameworks. But Flight 1713's investigation had found no mechanical failure, no crew error, no actionable negligence. The airline's attorneys argued that without identified cause, liability could not be established. Families' attorneys countered that passengers had died while under the airline's care, making the company responsible regardless of whether specific fault could be proven. The legal battle dragged on for years, with some families eventually accepting settlements, while others pursued litigation that remained unresolved long after the incident itself. Memorial services were held in the weeks following the tragedy, but the ceremonies carried a particular hollowness that attendees struggled to articulate. Eulogies attempted to make sense of senseless death, clergy offered comfort, while privately questioning how to reconcile unexplained tragedy with theological frameworks, and mourners gathered to honour the dead while harbouring questions that would never be answered. Caskets remained closed, the bodies having undergone extensive examination, and the physical absence mirrored the absence of understanding that haunted every aspect of the mourning process. Support groups formed organically as families sought solace among the only people who truly understood their specific form of grief. Monthly gatherings in Boston brought together spouses, parents, siblings, and children of the victims, creating spaces where questions could be asked without judgment and where the particular pain of unexplained loss could be acknowledged. These groups became lifelines for many, offering understanding that even the most compassionate outsiders could not provide. The shared impossibility of the loss created bonds between people who would never have met under other circumstances, their common tragedy forging connections that endured for years. Different families adopted different coping strategies, their approaches as varied as the individuals they mourned. Some became advocates, pressuring authorities to keep the investigation active, funding independent research, and refusing to let the mystery fade from public attention. They organised anniversary vigils, maintained websites documenting the case, and wrote letters to politicians demanding continued efforts to find answers. Their activism gave purpose to grief, channeling pain into action even when that action produced no results. Others withdrew entirely, finding the constant reminders too painful to bear. They changed phone numbers, avoided media coverage, and tried to move forward by focusing on living rather than dwelling on death they could not understand. Media attention re-victimized families with predictable regularity. Every anniversary brought reporters back to their doors, requesting interviews and asking the same unanswerable questions year after year. Some families learned to use media attention to keep pressure on investigators, giving carefully controlled interviews that emphasized the need for continued research. Others felt exploited, their grief commodified for news cycles that moved on to other tragedies, while they remained trapped in theirs. The persistent attention made healing more difficult, preventing the natural fading of acute pain that time usually brings to loss. Children who lost parents on Flight 1713 faced particular challenges. They grew up with an absence that could not be explained even in adult terms, let alone in language appropriate for young minds trying to understand why mommy or daddy never came home. In university, lecture halls, and research laboratories across the world, the incident became a case study in multiple disciplines, a perfect intersection of aviation, medicine, psychology, and the limits of human knowledge. Aviation safety programs at major universities incorporated Flight 17113 into their curricula within months of the final report's release, using it to teach students about the boundaries of investigative methodology and the humbling reality that not every incident yields to analysis. The case challenged conventional frameworks that assumed proper investigation would always identify contributing factors, forcing students to confront the possibility that some events simply existed outside the realm of explanation that their training prepared them to provide. Flight training courses used the incident to discuss decision-making under conditions of profound uncertainty. The fighter pilots who had intercepted the aircraft, the air traffic controllers who had managed the unresponsive flight, and the emergency responders who had approached the landed aircraft all faced situations without precedent or protocol. Their actions became subjects of analysis in courses that typically dealt with more conventional scenarios, and the discussions revealed how professionals adapted when their training failed to cover the situation they confronted. The case demonstrated that expertise had limits, and that acknowledging those limits with honesty represented its own form of professional competence. Medical schools examined the case from multiple angles, incorporating it into courses on forensic pathology, toxicology, and diagnostic reasoning. The comprehensive autopsies that had found nothing became teaching examples of how to document negative findings with the same rigor applied to positive ones. Students learned that medicine's power came not just from identifying disease, but from knowing the boundaries beyond which identification became impossible. The case challenged the assumption that every death had a detectable cause, forcing future physicians to develop comfort with uncertainty that their training otherwise discouraged. Psychology departments found rich material in studying human responses to unexplainable events. Researchers analysed how people constructed narratives to fill gaps in understanding, how conspiracy theories formed and spread in the absence of official explanation, and how individuals coped with grief complicated by mystery. The incident provided natural experiments in pattern-seeking behaviour, confirmation bias, and the psychological need for closure. Graduate students wrote dissertations examining how families adapted to loss without explanation, their research contributing to broader understanding of complicated grief and ambiguous loss. Philosophy courses engaged with the case as an epistemological puzzle. What constituted knowledge when investigation produced no definitive answers? How should society respond when expertise admitted defeat? The incident raised questions about the nature of explanation itself, whether some events genuinely resisted explanation, or whether explanation simply awaited future scientific advancement. Debates in philosophy seminars ranged across metaphysics, philosophy of science, and ethics, with Flight 799 serving as concrete example for abstract arguments about the limits of human understanding. Consciousness researchers found the case particularly intriguing for what it suggested about the nature of awareness and its cessation. If 121 conscious beings had stopped being conscious simultaneously, what did that imply about consciousness as phenomenon? The incident challenged models that treated awareness as purely individual, suggesting instead that consciousness might involve field effects or collective properties that science had not yet characterized. These discussions remained speculative, occurring at the boundary between legitimate research and philosophical conjecture, but they attracted serious scholars willing to consider unconventional frameworks. Academic papers appeared across journals in aviation medicine, forensic science, psychology, and interdisciplinary publications that welcomed unusual cases. Each paper approached the incident from its discipline's perspective, analysing specific aspects while acknowledging the larger mystery remained unsolved. Citations accumulated as subsequent researchers referenced the case in their own work, building a scholarly literature around an event that ultimately taught more through its resistance to understanding than through any positive conclusions it allowed. The papers demonstrated how academic inquiry could extract value from mystery even when it could not extract solutions. Conferences brought together researchers from different disciplines to share findings and perspectives. These gatherings acknowledged that single-discipline approaches had proven insufficient, and that if progress were to be made, it would require integration across traditional academic boundaries. Presentations covered everything from electromagnetic theory to grief counselling, from aviation engineering to quantum physics. The breadth of topics reflecting how thoroughly the incident had defied categorization. Participants left these conferences humbled by complexity and energized by the challenge of addressing questions that had no easy answers. The educational value of the case extended beyond specific findings to broader lessons about humility and limitation. Students across disciplines learned that expertise did not guarantee answers, that rigorous methodology sometimes encountered phenomena it could not pass, and that acknowledging ignorance represented intellectual honesty rather than failure. In an educational system that typically rewarded certainty and penalized doubt, Flight 1713 offered counterbalance by demonstrating that uncertainty was sometimes the only honest conclusion available. More than 2 decades have passed since that September morning when 121 people died in their seats while the aircraft continued flying, and in the intervening years technology has advanced, investigation techniques have improved, yet the core mystery remains exactly as impenetrable as the day it occurred. The case file sits in federal archives, officially classified as open but practically dormant, reviewed periodically by investigators who approach it hoping that time and distance might reveal patterns invisible to those who worked it fresh. Each review produces the same conclusion. The evidence supports no determination of cause, and absent new information or revolutionary analytical methods, the incident resists solution as stubbornly now as it did in 2003. Technology that did not exist during the original investigation has been applied to the preserved evidence, with results that range from disappointing to frustrating. Advanced DNA analysis techniques, developed for other purposes, have been used on tissue samples, revealing nothing beyond what was known decades earlier. Sophisticated computer modelling has recreated the flight conditions thousands of times, searching for combinations of factors that might explain the deaths, but no simulation has produced a scenario that matches all the evidence. The data remains exactly what it was: comprehensive, meticulously documented, and utterly uninformative about the central question of why everyone aboard died. The aircraft itself no longer exists as a complete entity. After years of storage in a secure facility, where it served no purpose beyond occupying expensive space, the decision was made to dismantle it for parts and scrap. The engines found second lives in other aircraft, the avionics were salvaged for training purposes, and the airframe was cut up and recycled. Some items were preserved for the Aviation Museum collection, including a section of fuselage and the cockpit instrument panel, where they sit behind glass with a placard describing the incident in carefully neutral language that reveals nothing because there is nothing to reveal. Visitors sometimes pause to read the placard, their faces showing the same confusion that investigators felt, before moving on to exhibits that offer more satisfying narratives. Families of the victims continue their annual memorial service, though attendance has dwindled as the years have transformed grief into something more distant and manageable. The original organisers are now elderly, their energy for maintaining the tradition fading as they themselves approach the end of their own journeys. Some family members have died in the intervening years, their own deaths from natural causes coming as reminders that time continues its forward march regardless of mysteries left unsolved. Younger generations attend the memorials less consistently, their connection to relatives they never knew or barely remember less compelling than the daily demands of their own lives. The ceremony persists, but it has taken on the quality of ritual maintained more from obligation than need. Researchers still occasionally publish papers on the case, though with decreasing frequency as the years pass without new insights. The academic literature has largely exhausted what can be said about the incident using available evidence, and subsequent papers tend to recapitulate earlier findings or propose variations on theories already explored. Some researchers have moved on to other mysteries, their interest in Flight 1713 fading as it became clear that the case would not yield to analysis no matter how creatively applied. Others remain fixated on it, their careers defined by their association with the unsolvable incident, though they too have ceased expecting breakthrough. New incidents matching the Flight 1713 pattern have not occurred, at least not in any documented form accessible to researchers. Aviation continues with occasional accidents and mysteries, but none have involved simultaneous death of all aboard while the aircraft continued flying normally. The incident stands alone in aviation history, sui generis and unrepeated, offering no comparative cases that might illuminate its nature through similarity. Whether this uniqueness represents genuine singularity or simply the limits of documentation remains unknowable, but the practical effect is to leave Flight 1713 isolated in time and circumstance. Conspiracy theories have evolved and multiplied online, where new generations discover the story and construct their own explanations, unburdened by evidence or expertise. Forums and social media groups dedicated to the mystery attract enthusiasts who approach it as puzzle to be solved through crowd-sourced investigation, though their efforts typically recycle the same debunked theories that emerged in the immediate aftermath. Some groups have developed elaborate narratives involving government experiments, alien intervention, or temporal anomalies, their certainty inversely proportional to their actual knowledge of the case. The official investigation report sits freely available online, but it attracts less attention than sensationalized retellings that promise answers it cannot provide. Media returns to the story on significant anniversaries, producing documentaries and news segments that frame the incident as one of aviation's greatest mysteries. These productions interview aging investigators who repeat the same observations they have made for 2 decades, present the same evidence that has always existed, and arrive at the same absence of conclusion. The production values improve with each iteration as video technology advances, but the content remains static, fixed by the immutable fact that the mystery has not been solved, and shows no signs of yielding to time or attention. The departure gate has been remodelled twice since that morning, the waiting area configured differently. The shops changed and changed again, yet some who pass through swear they can feel something in the air, a heaviness that has nothing to do with barometric pressure. Gate B17 at Denver International Airport handles dozens of flights each week. Its ticket counter staffed by agents who process passengers with efficient professionalism. Its jet bridge extending to welcome aircraft that arrive and depart on schedules maintained with remarkable precision. Nothing about the physical space suggests tragedy occurred here. No plaque marks the location, where 121 people boarded a flight they would never survive. An airline policy deliberately avoids memorializing incidents at operational gates where such reminders might disturb travelers already anxious about flying. Yet the gate carries memory in ways that transcend physical markers. Older airport employees, those who worked at Denver International in 2003, remember the morning and the days that followed when the gate area became a gathering point for media and grieving families. They tell newer employees about it during training, unofficial histories passed along in break rooms and during slow shifts, and some admit they feel uncomfortable working that particular gate even though they cannot articulate exactly why. The discomfort may be nothing more than knowledge-colouring perception, the mind imposing significance on ordinary space because it knows what happened there, but the feeling persists regardless of its origin. The taxiways and runway from which Flight 1713 departed remain in constant use, aircraft rolling along the same concrete paths dozens of times daily. Pilots steering their aircraft along these routes have no way of knowing they're following in the literal tracks of a mystery, and air traffic controllers directing traffic through Denver's airspace make no mention of the incident when issuing routing instructions. Professionally, it is simply one of many gates, one of many departure paths, and treating it otherwise would serve no practical purpose in an environment where focus must remain on current operations, rather than past tragedies. The flight path itself sees regular traffic, aircraft still following similar routes between Denver and Boston, cruising at the same altitudes, passing over the same states where Flight 1713's occupants died. Some pilots flying this route know the story and think about it during quiet moments at cruise altitude, their thoughts drifting to what the crew aboard that flight experienced in their final minutes. Others remain unaware, the incident having occurred before they entered aviation careers, and they fly the route as they would any other, their attention focused on weather, fuel management, and the routine tasks that occupy commercial pilots during cross-country flights. Boston's Logan International Airport, where the aircraft landed itself, has seen similar physical transformation. The taxiway where emergency crews surrounded the silent aircraft has been resurfaced multiple times. Its designation changed during airport reorganization, and no sign indicates that anything unusual occurred there. The hangar where investigators worked for months examining every aspect of the aircraft now houses different aircraft undergoing different maintenance, its workers going about their tasks without thought for what transpired there 2 decades earlier. Some older mechanics remember the investigation, recall seeing the aircraft surrounded by equipment and personnel, but for most who work in the facility now, it is simply the place where they earn their living. A memorial stands outside Logan's main terminal, accessible to the public without requiring passage through security. The design is simple and dignified, conceived through collaboration with families who wanted something that honoured the dead without sensationalising the mystery. 121 names are carved into black granite, arranged alphabetically without distinction between passengers and crew, each name representing a life ended without explanation. Below the names, a single phrase appears. Their journey ended here, but their memory endures. No mention is made of the impossible circumstances, no reference to the mystery that brought these specific names together on this memorial. Flowers appear regularly at the memorial base, left by family members on birthdays and anniversaries, and occasionally by strangers who have learned the story and feel moved to acknowledge it. The flowers wilt and are removed by maintenance staff, replaced by new bouquets, in a cycle that has continued for years. Small notes sometimes accompany the flowers, messages to the dead or questions about what happened, their words expressing the same confusion and sadness that has characterized every response to the incident since its occurrence. Visitors to the memorial stand in silence, reading the names and dates, their faces showing the particular expression that comes when confronting tragedy. Some take photographs, others simply stand for a few minutes before walking away. The memorial has become a minor stop on amateur mystery tours, groups of people fascinated by unexplained events making pilgrimages to sites associated with famous cases. Robert Martinez, now 73 and long retired from the National Transportation Safety Board, sits in his study, surrounded by aviation books and framed commendations from a career spanning 4 decades. But when asked about the cases that defined his professional life, he does not hesitate. The flight, always the flight, he says, his voice carrying the particular weariness that comes from years of thinking about questions that have no answers. He had been the lead investigator on Flight 1713, appointed to the role because of his experience with complex accidents and his reputation for methodical thoroughness. But neither quality proved sufficient when confronted with an incident that seemed to exist outside the frameworks his training had provided. Martinez describes the investigation as the most comprehensive he ever directed, a statement that carries weight given his involvement in major accident investigations throughout his career. "We examined everything," he says, leaning back in his chair, his hands gesturing to emphasize the scope. "Every rivet, every wire, every drop of fluid. We tested things that had no logical connection to what happened, just to be absolutely certain we were not missing something." The examination consumed months and involved specialists from dozens of disciplines, each bringing expertise to bear on different aspects of the mystery. Yet all that expertise, all that effort, produced no explanation, only the confirmation that conventional investigation methods were inadequate when applied to the genuinely inexplicable. His certainty about the investigation's thoroughness never wavered, but his expectation of solving the case evolved dramatically over the course of that first year. During the initial weeks, Martinez recalls believing that answers would emerge once enough evidence was gathered and analysed. "I thought we just needed more data, more testing, more expert consultation," he explains. "There's always that period where you're assembling pieces and the picture is not yet clear. I assumed we were in that phase." By the 3rd month, his confidence had begun eroding as each new test came back negative, and each expert consultation ended without breakthrough. By 6 months, he had started preparing himself for the possibility that the case might never close with definitive findings, though he continued pushing the investigation forward with the same rigour as if certainty remained attainable. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the medical examiner who performed the first autopsies, is now 81 and retired from practice, but she still thinks about the bodies from Flight 1713 with regularity that surprises her. "I have performed thousands of autopsies," she says from her apartment overlooking Boston Harbor. "But those passengers and crew were the only ones who made no sense at all. Healthy organs, normal tissue, no toxins, no disease. They should have been alive." She pauses, looking out toward the airport visible in the distance. Sometimes I wake up thinking I have figured it out, that there was something I missed in the examinations. Then I remember that dozens of other pathologists looked at the same evidence and found the same nothing. The case affected her approach to medicine in ways both subtle and profound. She became more comfortable with uncertainty, more willing to acknowledge the limits of diagnostic capabilities. Before Flight 1713, I believed that if you looked hard enough and used the right tests, you could always find the cause, she explains. That case taught me that belief was arrogant. Sometimes the body keeps its secrets. The lesson was hard-earned and came at personal cost. She admits to months of insomnia during the investigation, lying awake reviewing autopsy findings in her mind, searching for patterns that were not there. James Cooper, the air traffic controller, who first noticed the aircraft's radio silence, left the profession 5 years after the incident. Now 68 and working as a flight instructor at a small airport in Arizona, he describes that morning with perfect clarity despite the passage of time. You never forget when something like that happens on your watch, he says. I thought it was equipment failure, just a stuck microphone or a radio malfunction. Then when we found out everyone was dead, I kept thinking there must have been something in the transmissions, some hint I missed that would have told us what was happening. He listened to recordings of those final communications dozens of times, analysing every word and every pause, but found nothing that suggested awareness of impending catastrophe. What do they think happened? The question produces thoughtful pauses from each of them, the silence of people who have learned the difference between speculation and knowledge. Martinez suggests that some natural phenomenon not yet understood by science might have been responsible, though he immediately acknowledges this is faith rather than evidence speaking. Warren leans toward a medical condition that current science cannot detect, perhaps something affecting cellular function in ways that leave no post-mortem traces. Cooper admits he has no theory at all, just questions that have followed him through 2 decades. All three emphasize that they did their best with the tools and knowledge available, and none express regret about how the investigation was conducted. If there was an answer to be found, we would have found it, Martinez says with quiet certainty. Perhaps there is no answer, he suggests, or perhaps the answer exists, but requires understanding that humanity has not yet developed. The cockpit section sits in a museum now, roped off behind velvet, its instruments frozen in the positions they held when the aircraft landed itself, and visitors walk past reading placards that explain everything except the one thing that matters, why everyone aboard died without reason. The display is professionally curated, the lighting designed to highlight the equipment without creating glare on the instrument faces, and the information panels provide context about the Boeing 757, about autopilot systems, and about the investigation that followed. But the final panel ends with a paragraph that acknowledges what cannot be explained. Its carefully neutral language admitting defeat while maintaining the museum's educational mission. The case remains technically open in federal files, subject to periodic review that has produced no new insights despite advances in forensic science and investigative technology. New investigators occasionally request access to the evidence, hoping that fresh perspectives or novel analytical approaches might reveal what eluded their predecessors. But each review ends with the same conclusion, documented in reports that grow increasingly brief as the years provide less new material to discuss. The investigation proved that thorough methodology and unlimited resources cannot solve every mystery, a lesson that challenges the assumptions underlying modern investigative practice. Why does Flight 1713 continue to captivate public imagination more than 2 decades after it occurred? Perhaps because it represents a truly unexplainable event in an era when we have grown accustomed to explanations for everything. Modern life is documented, analysed, and understood with unprecedented precision. Yet here is an incident that resists all attempts at comprehension. The mystery offers no comfortable theories to embrace, no villains to blame, no mechanical failures to correct. It simply exists as a void in understanding, a permanent question mark in the record of human experience. For those who lost loved ones on that flight, the enduring mystery represents continuing burden. They have learned to live with grief, compounded by uncertainty, finding their own paths toward acceptance, even as the larger questions remain unanswered. Their loss cannot be explained, cannot be prevented from happening again, because no one knows what happened in the first place, and cannot be given the meaning that closure might provide. They carry forward in the knowledge that some questions have no answers, and that peace must be found despite rather than through understanding. The aircraft that flew itself to Boston, with 121 dead aboard, stands as testament to the limits of human knowledge, a reminder that reality contains depths we cannot measure, and mysteries we cannot solve, regardless of how sophisticated our tools become or how determined our efforts. What killed those people may never be known, and perhaps that unknowing serves its own purpose, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that not everything in this world yields to investigation, that some events simply occur beyond our capacity to comprehend them, leaving behind only questions that echo unanswered through the years like the silent aircraft crossing an empty sky.